So alfalfa, just kind of give you a little bit of an overview of some of the things we're going to talk about today. Alfalfa has kind of a few requirements that need to really be in place. First of all, it has to be well-drained soils. It does not tolerate wet feet, which is, we're used to that with Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is very similar. It does not like wet feet. So, you know, pretty much where Bermuda grass will work, alfalfa will work if the fertility is right. And that's the other thing that's very much an important part of this is soil fertility. So if the P and the K are in really good shape, and the pH is also a very, very crucial part of this too, which I'll talk more about in a moment. We should be able to get 3 to 5 years out of that in the coastal plain region. And so we feel pretty confident that we can get that. Now there are some locations that are getting much longer than that even. We have a stand at the Sunbelt Ag Expo that was planted before I came to University of Georgia over 12 years ago. And it's still in decent shape. It's thinned down quite a bit, but it's a really good balance of Bermuda grass and alfalfa together. Of course, under irrigation, it will thrive even more. You'll get more production, but generally speaking, even under dry conditions, we can get pretty good yields off of it in the 4 to 6 tons of dry matter to the acre range. With irrigation, we can push that up maybe to 7 or 8 tons, depending on the site and the fertility of that soil. The soil pH is most often the biggest limitation for most operations, although if there's been a history of keeping that up, then this would be a great field for one to try alfalfa in. In the surface soil, if that pH is 6.5 or above, then we are good to go. We're ready to go. If the subsoil pH is above 5.5, we also are in good shape too. Now that says down to 4 feet, and I keep meaning to change that. I really feel like if we can get down to about a foot, normally down below a foot deep, as you go deeper, it's pretty much going to be roughly the same subsoil pH as you go down deeper than that. So roughly about a foot deep, if we measure the subsoil pH and it's greater than 5.5, we're in good shape. And the reason for that is that alfalfa is very sensitive to aluminum toxicity in the soil. And aluminum becomes soluble in the soil whenever the pH drops below about 5.5, 5.6 or so. So this is a very major concern if we are growing, and that's true of all forage crops too, by the way. Bermuda grass is also sensitive to acid subsoil pH, but if we're able to correct that, we will be able to grow alfalfa quite well. So that, again, a well-drained, deep, fertile soil is really the ultimate. It does have the potential to bloat animals if they're grazing on it, but if we are monitoring what those animals are doing, especially for grazing alfalfa in a mixture, which most of our conditions that we're going to be promoting are mixtures of grasses with the alfalfa, then the bloat potential is greatly reduced by that. And there are even some strategies that we can put into place to minimize the potential of bloat. But I firmly believe that there's been more money lost out of the fear of bloat than ever was lost to bloat itself. So that, to me, that is a manageable issue for sure. Our primary uses are for hay. Most of our growers are growing this for commercial hay or for their own operations. Some of them are making baleage off of it. Some in our dairies are cutting it for silage as well. But then we also have a fair number of folks. In fact, on Thursday, our visit to the farm in Irwin County that we're going to, he's exclusively using it for grazing. Maybe taking a little bit of baleage off of it, but most everything in his case is going to be grazing in his case. In Watkinsville, at our research station there near Athens, we will make baleage off of the first, maybe even the second cutting, and the last cutting of the year, and we'll graze a little bit during the summer, and we'll also take a few hay cuttings off during the summer. So it's a little bit of everything for us. And at that particular station, we don't have any straight Bermuda grass anymore. It's all Bermuda grass and alfalfa interseeded into it now. If we're going to establishment, and we're going to talk more details about establishment later on, but these would be the seeding rates that we're talking about. And if we're widening out our row spacing and going to maybe a 15-inch row spacing, we'll be able to drop this down. But just suffice it to say, for the moment, that's kind of the seeding rates that you're looking at the moment. And these are the three varieties that I mentioned. Alpha Gray's 600RR would be our Roundup Ready variety that would be very well suited to our area of the state. Bulldog 505 is also planted statewide, and then Bulldog 805 is really more exclusively here in South Georgia where it's going to thrive. It does have a longer growing season, so it starts a little bit earlier, say in around the 1st of February or so, and keeps growing all the way through the end of November. And so as a result, we can get a little bit more grazing off of it through the season, so it works really well for that purpose. And of course, it has some really high quality and high value to it, and we'll talk more about how that fits in a little bit. But as I mentioned, really the reason we're here is the breeding efforts that Dr. Boughton has been able to accomplish here. And you can see kind of the conventional variety there on the right, and compared to some of the varieties that he has developed over time. And he's going to fill in some more of the details of where we're at right now, but also where we're heading in the future with some of the breeding program with the new forage breeder who is at the University of Georgia, who took over after Joe retired. So with that, we're going to begin the discussion here of how to actually get it established. And Dr. Jennifer Tucker, who is a researcher at Tifton, has been doing a lot of research with the alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures, is going to talk a little bit about site selection and some of the lessons we've learned over time of establishment as well. So.
Okay, so as he said, I do a lot of work right now in Tifton. I'm doing a lot of interseeded work with alfalfa and Bermuda grass. And so we're first going to talk about just some of the basics of alfalfa, but as you'll see throughout the trend today and as we go out to the farm, that's kind of what we're going towards with alfalfa production in this area, is looking at those interseeded mixes with alfalfa and Bermuda grass. And so he went through all this information. If you see this multiple times throughout the day as well as in your notebooks, maybe that's because there's some important stuff here, and this gives you all the general information as you're making those decisions for site selection. So the other question is, what about interseeding, and why should we consider interseeding? And if we look at our relative forage quality, we can see that there, depending on the different forages that we grow, there's a range that we see. And these are all numbers that came actually from Georgia, from our few labs. So these are samples that everyone has sent in and looked at. It's not just research samples. But we also see there's a lot of variation when we're using different forages and at different stages of growth, and we know that. But when you look specifically at our Bermuda grass and then our alfalfa, we can see that our alfalfa tends to have a higher quality than our Bermuda grass. So when you start to mix the two together, then maybe you're creating a higher quality product overall. Maybe not always at the highest quality of that alfalfa, as we usually sit around the 200s of that RFQ, but definitely improving the quality of those mixtures. So also when we look at that, and we look at our stages of growth, we look at our Bermuda grass at the 4 weeks and 8 weeks, and we see the crude protein, TDM levels, and then you start to look at our alfalfa, and across the board, that alfalfa quality tends to be higher than that Bermuda grass, really no matter at what stage of growth. So it really does look like a good combination to put the two together. So some of the reasons and why do we want to interseed alfalfa into Bermuda grass. First of all, it's an option to grow your own nitrogen. So any of us that are Bermuda grass producers, we know that to have a high quality product and to get the yield that we're looking for, you have to add a lot of nitrogen to that system. With our alfalfa, we obviously are working with a legume. It's really good at fixing nitrogen, and so you can tend to eliminate that need for nitrogen for the Bermuda grass in that mixture. You can increase the quality of your forage, as we talked about. We see anywhere between 30 points and greater on that RFQ levels when we start to add that mixture in there. And so that really helps us when we're looking at feeding options for our livestock, because you have that higher quality option there. It's going to make an excellent supplemental feed and or a cash hay crop. And so that's the other thing that we need to consider when we get into a lot of our Bermuda grasses. If we aren't harvesting on that regular rotation that we're looking at, and even some of our cuttings, they're just not going to meet the needs of our livestock. When you add that alfalfa in there, then you tend to see a decrease in the need for a lot of excess supplement for your livestock animals. So it's another benefit to using that alfalfa, because it is such a high quality option. Growing Bermuda grass with alfalfa allows it to dry faster and be harvested clean. And so we do see that. We'll talk a little bit about the technology, I think, later in the day when we are harvesting and how we want to manage that. But it does help us on the harvesting standpoint. Prevents the Bermuda grass stem maggot damage, and so what we are seeing is there seems to be less incidence of the stem maggot in the Bermuda grass mixtures as compared to Bermuda grass alone. And Dr. Moussaoui is not going to be here today, but we do have Dr. Baxter here who actually does a lot of work with the stem maggot. So if you have any questions about the Bermuda grass stem maggot, Lisa's in the back, so you can ask her about those specifically. And if all else fails in this system, you still have Bermuda grass. And so we are, when you're planting alfalfa, it is a big economic input and something that we have to strongly consider as we're finding those locations. But if we have this mixture and maybe we hit a year that it's too dry or, too wet or whatever, we just don't get things exactly right, you still have that Bermuda grass, if the alfalfa doesn't come up or if the stand only lasts a little bit of a short amount of time. So that's the good safe ball in this system is that you still have something there. Obviously, we consider it a winning combination because it's going to increase the quality of the product produced on that unit of land during that time period, as well as extend the opportunities for production on that unit. And of course, we said those RFQ anywhere to 30 plus points. Crude protein numbers tend to increase 14 to 18% or higher, and our TDN levels anywhere between 60 and 64% or higher. Those are numbers that we're really looking for when we're trying to meet the needs of our livestock. So into the specifics, as you said, we're going to just talk about right now the site selection and establishment. A lot of this stuff you're going to hear a little bit more about later when we get into those insects and weed management. So this is what we need to do at the beginning, but it's things that we'll also need to continue throughout managing these systems. So where to start? The first thing we need to get, okay, we're all, a lot of us work in extension here. If you call an extension agent and you say you have a problem in your field, what is the first thing they ask to see? This is the interactive part. All right, what do you need? Soil test. All right, so where to start? The first thing you need is a soil test. The second thing you need is a soil test. The third thing you need is a soil test. All right, we want to make sure before you ever make the decision to put alfalfa in the ground that we know what kind of ground we're working with. All right, so we want to make sure we have a target pH of a 6.5 or greater. This is, obviously a legume. Definitely some of our legumes have a little bit more leniency. We want to get to that 6.5 or greater, all right, and that or greater emphasis there. So if we start working with a 6, we need to get that pH level up before we start that. The other key factor that, especially where we're at in Tifton, we're working in that coastal plain soils, is that subsoil pH. So about a foot deep, if you're looking, you need to look at that subsoil pH, and we want it to be a 5.5 or greater. So what we tend to see is that our topsoil pH might be where it needs to be, and we can get lime, put lime on that and increase that. But that subsoil level is really low, and if you get to that point, you got to think about that taproot of alfalfa. It grows very, very deep, and we tend to see that it'll hit that pH, and then it's not able to sustain itself because it doesn't have the environment there that it needs. So if your subsoil pH is not in this range of a 5.5, we're probably going to tell you to go on and pick a different location. Okay, Will can probably help you with taking some subsoil pH. A lot of people ask how we get to that level. If you're using a hay probe, don't use a hay probe on this. If you're using a soil probe and you get that top 6 inches for your topsoil, go right back in that same hole and get further down in there to get that 1 foot. So we have a range there. So that is the one thing when a lot of people call me, I need to see that subsoil pH before I can say, yes, this is a good area to plant your alfalfa. You're also going to need areas that are high in P and high in K. Potassium is very important. We already know that for Bermuda grass production. It's the same in alfalfa. We need to have potassium out there, really be paying attention to our potassium. So you want to go ahead and pick environments that are conducive. And we don't want to forget those micronutrients. Molybdenum and boron are very important in alfalfa production. And we don't want to skip in those areas either. So thinking about species, soil, and management, and so we're deciding where we're going to put our alfalfa in. All right, if you have a field that's not very productive and you think, hey, I'll put some alfalfa there, that'll make it productive, don't use that field. Don't even worry about that field. So when we're trying to decide and we're looking at our soil conditions from our poor soils to our best soils, and then we're looking at the management skill required, Bermuda grass kind of, it goes across the board, kind of depending on what level of production we're at or what varieties that we're working with. And so it's pretty lenient, okay, all across the board when you're looking at our management as well as our soil conditions. We go to perennial peanut because you hear a lot of people comparing alfalfa and perennial peanut. That's a higher input, both on the labor side as well as on a soil side and your conditions. And then we look at alfalfa, all right? That's going to be a high labor input, but it also wants your best soil. Okay, we don't want to put it in an area that's already going to be having to struggle to get through. So you want to be making this selection. It is a high commodity crop. We need to think about this as a crop and treat it as such. All right, so pick your good land. That's the areas that we need to be putting that in. And if you're interseeding it into Bermuda grass, again, you don't want that hay field that's not doing very well. You want to make sure that those soil conditions are right to put that alfalfa in there. Poorly drained soils is a major challenge for alfalfa. It's very common to go out into a field and see these areas where it's just not growing. It does not like to have wet feet, just like Bermuda grass. So that's why, again, it's a good mixture with the two because they kind of like the same environment to grow in. Again, we talked about that soil pH. With that alfalfa, you want to get in that 6.5 to 7 range. Perennial peanut, that gives you a little bit more leniency there. And then we look at our clovers and some of the other things. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where you may not have that ideal 6.5 that you're looking for, and you put some clover out there and you got some. That may not be the case with your alfalfa. You need to make sure that alfalfa, that pH is on up there. We get into situations with aluminum toxicity, especially in low pH soils, and then Dennis is going to talk about this a little bit more in depth later, but looking at having the proper pH and seeing the growth compared to having a low pH soil is just not what we're looking for. All right, weed control, that's a big part, right? It's something that starts at the beginning. I know it's hard to see, but there is some alfalfa growing in here. But there's also some mare's tail and some dog fennel and some everything else, okay? So weed control is very, very important, and we want to manage our weeds during that establishment. The first thing you want to do is know what your problems are out there and control what you can, all right? Now, when you're working in an interseeded mix, you're going to have a little bit more challenge when it comes to that weed control. But the other thing is you don't want to skimp out on weed control before you plant and before you establish, and then come back and have the situation like this where now you're trying to figure out what you can do. Okay, so we need to be sure that we're going ahead and being very cognizant of our weed issues. Determine if treatment is warranted. There are some times, and we have even this at the research farm, we have an area that is pretty weedy, but the whole field is not weedy. And so then you have to decide if it's something that you need to go through and put that input in there, depending on what those weeds are, and maybe something's happening in that particular spot. If you're using Roundup Ready technology, glyphosate is your friend. Again, this is one of those times that I've had this conversation with Dr. Boughton several times. I didn't think that it was that big of a deal for us to have Roundup Ready in a mixture, especially if we're doing alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures. And so, what we've been using primarily for our research projects is Bulldog 805. And now on 2 different occasions, I wish I had that Roundup Ready technology. The first year we planted, it was in an extreme drought. No. The first year we planted, it was extremely hot. We went into Tipton 85 Bermuda grass. We did everything like we're supposed to. We talked about how to establish it, all of that stuff. And then we got into Christmas, and it was 85 on Christmas. And we got into January, and it was 85 on January. And if anybody grows Tipton 85, Tipton 85 likes it 85 degrees, right? So even though we had shut it down, it did not stay dormant. It was a year, we got several calls, can I cut hay? Because I've got Bermuda grass in January. So for that reason, we had a lot of competition, and our alfalfa stand did not make. Now, that's not your normal situation, not your normal, you wouldn't have those temperatures typically, but had we had that Roundup Ready technology, we could have used the Roundup to go ahead and induce that 85 back into dormancy, and that would have helped that alfalfa to come through that. Another occasion we had, again, some of those winter weeds that became a big problem and almost overtook a stand of ours. And again, had we had that Roundup technology, that would have been something we could have used even in the mixture, which beforehand I thought, why are we going to need that? We're not going to use that. So, I guess some of the lessons are the hardest learned or expensive learned. If you're in a conventional establishment situation, there are plenty of options. However, know that they may damage your alfalfa for a period of time. Dennis is going to talk about those specific chemistries a little bit later. And so there is potential, and we've seen this, some yellowing that you might see on your alfalfa, but know that there are some options in that situation. And again, weed control is going to be even harder in a mix because a lot of our chemistries like Select that take out grass herbicides will also take out Bermuda grass. And so we don't want to use those technologies, and some of them are just on different rates. Then after you have it established, there are pre-emergent technologies, and they are warranted to use, especially for crabgrass control and annual ryegrass and some of these options with our annual grasses, because they can be pretty significant in our stands. When you're choosing a location, you want to make sure that you choose an area that doesn't have residual herbicides that have been applied recently. If you've applied Grazon Next has a very long residual, which can have a negative effect on the establishment of our alfalfa. So you want to make sure that you've given it at least a year or so out of that, or 10 to 12 months is what it says here for the aminopyrrolid, just to give yourself some leeway, because again, you don't want to have, you don't want to start behind the 8 ball and give yourself a problem here with those technologies. All right, so when do we plant? Obviously, we want to plant when the conditions are right, and that's every day, right? We find, today is the day to plant. But when your conditions are favorable, recommended plantings in northern Georgia between September 15 and October 15. In southern Georgia between October 15 and November 15. A couple years ago, extreme drought, we planted December 13th. All right, that is not our recommendation. We don't recommend planting December 13th. We have had to replant that stand. So we went ahead and tried, because that's what we do for research. So around southern Georgia, what I tell people is start to shoot for sunbelt. All right, that sunbelt time period, that's when you should be considering putting in alfalfa, especially into these mixtures. You also want to make sure there's plenty of soil moisture, and the temperatures have started to drop into a favorable range of planting success. Like I said, we had 85 degrees a couple years ago that it never slowed down and stopped. You do want to use a no-till drill when planting, and you want to make sure you plant no deeper than a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch is better. And I say this because we learned that lesson as well. I mean, you get too far down in there and you can have a good stand and be looking at, we have a hill that you can look at right now, and you see the alfalfa is growing, and then there's a spot that is just not there, and it's because as they were going down the hill, the drill got too deep. So make sure that your drill is not too deep. All right, so a 1/2 inch, just to get a good cover on that. It is a legume, it is a very small seed. In your Bermuda grass, I get a lot of people that say, I don't want to put Roundup on my Bermuda grass. All right, I don't want to do that. Can I just wait to plant it? Yes, we're going to recommend that you suppress that sod. Go ahead and put that Roundup out there on that Bermuda grass. It's not going to kill it. It's just going to shut it down so that you can interseed into it. If we hit a year like that 85-degree year and you haven't put the Roundup technology out there, and you haven't suppressed that sod, then you're already going to have so much competition out there. It's going to be potentially or probably a failed stand. This is also going to be more of a challenge when you're planting into cool season species. We do see some people that put them in with tall fescue. That's not something we really have to worry about in this part of the state. The seeding rate that we recommend, 20 to 25 pounds per acre. Does that change when we're interseeding, or what about with our row spacing? And so what we're seeing now, we did a lot of interseeding stuff to begin with our drills, where we used every line or every hole in there. Now we're starting to see success with, we're planting on 14 or 15 inch rows, whatever it happens to be, every other row on that drill. And so it actually is working out really good for our mixtures, because you get a good amount of alfalfa that doesn't really shade out your Bermuda grass. And then when the Bermuda grass is really flourishing, you still have, it really doesn't shade out your alfalfa. So it's really turning into a good situation. We have, and I'm going to show you some research too, where with such a close row spacing, that alfalfa almost took out some of the Bermuda grass. And that's not what we're wanting. We want a good combination of these mixtures. And as Dennis pointed out the other day, when you're going to that every other row spacing, then you can cut that seeding rate in half. All right, so you can put in, we usually say around 12 pounds an acre at that seeding rate. It's still going to give you the same idea as a 20 pound per acre. It's just that the area is now condensed into the 14 inch row instead of across all that row spacing. All right, so this is some work that they did in the 80s in South Carolina, and again, they were looking at the percentage of Bermuda grass. So if you look at the blue bars, that's Bermuda grass, and this is alfalfa, when they interseeded in the different row spacing. When you're looking at that 7.5-inch row spacing, they did see that the Bermuda grass stand decreased over time in comparison to using these wider row spacings. Now, especially if you're using something like a hybrid Bermuda grass like Tifton 85, I don't think we should be as concerned about the Bermuda grass going out. The alfalfa will grow really well, but the fact of the matter is that Bermuda grass will eventually take it over. So, you know, at the end of 5 years or however many years you end up having your alfalfa stand, you're still going to have Bermuda grass at the end of that. Some of the things about this particular project is they weren't using the hybrid Bermuda grass varieties that we typically use here, and they also had some nitrogen that they added into the system. So that's a little bit different than what we recommend now, but we did see that is a little bit of a concern is, you know, you might be taking out some of your Bermuda grass. So it increased the yield from interseeding alfalfa that coincided with a loss of Bermuda grass component with the stand after the 2 years of the evaluation, but we know how to manage around that. Some other things that we need to consider is inoculation. Everybody asked about legumes. Yes, you need to inoculate your legume seed. All right, you have to inoculate them. The good thing is the majority of your alfalfa, if not all, is it all alfalfa or just the majority, comes inoculated?
I don't think there are many varieties on the market that are not pre-inoculated.
Right, so most things already come coated now with the inoculant in there, so fail safe, you don't even have to worry about using the inoculant. Now make sure that if you are inoculating the seed yourself that you do use the proper inoculant. You know, not all inoculants are created equal. All right, so you need to use a specific rhizobium and then inoculate the seed, and then it often comes pre-inoculated. All right, so we have the seed in the ground. What do we need to do now? We need to worry about our bugs, okay? Insects like alfalfa, you know, it's a high quality crop, and all of our high quality crops, our bugs like them too, right? All right, so after emergence, we're gonna spray it with insecticide to control some of those insect pests. And what are some of the pests that we're talking about? Specifically the alfalfa weevil. We did have some alfalfa weevil damage, and this is what it looks like. It looks like something comes through and is munching on your plants. In Tifton, what we have found is areas that have had alfalfa historically or had a lot of alfalfa there, you tend to see a greater potential for alfalfa weevil. If there hasn't been a lot of alfalfa in the area, it's not going to be as big of a concern until you start to have it for multiple years. There is a shake bucket method. You can look it up on YouTube. Just Google alfalfa weevil shake bucket method. You know, get out there and look for those and make sure that you're scouting for those things. The other is potato leafhopper, and we see this damage a lot in our stands. Again, it's at a level of significance that needs treatment, sometimes, but not always. And when you look at that, it often looks a lot like potassium deficiency, but what you'll notice with the potato leafhopper is it goes down into that leaf rather than just at the tip with that discoloration. So if you see the discoloration comes all the way down, not just at the tip of that. So those are the two that we're seeing the most of in Tifton right now. And then obviously you have the armyworms that you have to fight, and everybody has to fight that. It doesn't really matter what crop you have. So how do we control this, or how do we know what's out there? As I'm known for saying, when in doubt, scout. All right, so this is a crop that you're going to need to be out there and looking at it and seeing what's going on. We scout our fields weekly at least, especially when we know that there's, you know, the conditions are favorable for a lot of insect damage. But get out there, do the shake bucket method, use sweep nets, and again, Will, you know, your county agent can come in and help you and walk you through this process. But that way you know, and you can determine if the threshold is worth, if it's warranting a spraying or not. So you got to know what's out there to know what chemistries to use. And to get some specifics, there's a lot of information both on insect and weed control on our IPM guide, and you can find that online, or you can find it at your local extension office. So all right, what about now? Irrigate if available. That is, if it's option, you know, especially already we're looking at this year, we're already getting pretty dry. You know, I looked at the calendar and I looked at the weather and it said 15 days and there was no rain in that 15 days. So, you know, alfalfa does like irrigation just like any other, especially during that establishment year. If it's an option, use it, all right? It's gonna like that rain. It's not always an option, and I understand that. The other, again, remember when in doubt, scout. And the other thing we like to say is use the goal method. So get out and look, all right? This is not, with any of our forages of forage management, you know, we don't want to just drive through our field and see things. We need to get out and be walking through our fields. And so that way we can really know what's happening and what's going on and how to manage those. And now that it's emerged and we're starting with that first cutting of the new stand, we do recommend allowing it to advance in maturity to at least that early bloom stage, if at all possible. And again, that's one of those things that you have to make that decision as you're going in the conditions each year. We want to let it to advance in that maturity just to give it's a real good go. It's going to develop those roots, get those carbohydrates in that root, and really go ahead and put it ahead of the game here with that first harvest. And then our subsequent harvest, we're going to recommend harvesting at a 10% bloom stage. I think Dennis is going to talk a little bit more about in the summer when we recommend kind of delaying that a little bit, and he's going to explain that. And we do that with our studies as well, especially as hot as it gets down in Tifton and it's dry. But we're going to recommend you get it onto that early bloom stage. Now, I have worked with a couple of producers that we had to go ahead and do a little bit early harvest. It wasn't at the bloom stage, was able to be harvested because they had some competition with some vetch this year and clover. It's been a pretty good clover year, and so they did go ahead and harvest a little bit before that bloom stage, but it worked out successfully. So that's if at all possible. All right, so the keys to remember: fertilize for your stands to survive. All right, we got to be sure we're starting out with that the target pH. Don't guess. Take a soil test. All right, you need to know what you're starting with. Pay attention to that potassium, and also remember those micronutrients. Meet your forage needs by controlling your weeds. Okay, so make sure you put in the weed control, because the last thing you want to do is put in a high commodity crop and then lose it to weeds. And then when in doubt, scout. Make sure that you're managing and getting out in those fields. All right, and this, you know, a lot of people say, will alfalfa grow in South Georgia? This was after we ended up having to do a spring planting, which we don't recommend doing. But in September, we had a pretty significant stand, so we were pretty happy to get that yield off of there.